Thank you. It's great to be on another panel and to contribute to this conversation. I think there are multiple, how can we benefit from the new dynamics? So the question is, what are the new dynamics? The new dynamics in terms of shifts in technology, new dynamics in terms of going from essentially a unipolar world to a multipolar world, new dynamics from the context of changes in supply chains and market fragmentation, new dynamics from the perspective of a reduction in aid, new dynamics from the perspective of strengthening of local currencies, and new dynamics from the perspective of a fast-growing population. So I think there are many angles to think of the new dynamics from. I think the most interesting of them is that we have a young population in one of the fastest growing segments of the world, which is positioned to deliver significant value to the world. So I would start by saying that how we benefit from this is by galvanizing our countries and our capital to bet on ourselves. And that for me would be the start point from how we benefit from these new dynamics. So I like to frame a context in conversations like this, and I thank my sister Ndidi for framing around the importance of having a single voice and the panel here. So let me frame this differently and pose a question to everyone. Let's say you had a teenager who's just out of school, is not doing well, and you wanted them to have an uplift in life. What would the first thing you'd do be? Tell them. I'm sure for most parents here, you'd tell them, get a job. And you'd want them to have a good job. Now, if we went to the basics, the wealth you have is a direct function of the job you do, very simply. So if you have a country filled with peasants and farmers, and you have a country filled with electrical and electronic engineers, it's not very hard to determine which of those would outperform each other. If I produce tomatoes and you produce BMWs and fighter jets, and you asked us to sit at the table and trade, there's no amount of tomatoes which would give you an equal buying power as somebody who makes a BMW or a fighter jet. So I guess the question we ask ourselves about the Africa we want and shared prosperity, I think has to start very simply with the quality of work we produce, Africa gives to the world, and the quality of jobs we have for ourselves. From the perspective of a market, I mean, we have an amazing market, we have an amazing opportunity, but we will never successfully capitalize on that market if we cannot effectively create high quality, meaningful jobs which serve the market. Our purchasing power is low. Our ability to drive and grow our economies is limited, largely because the work we do is low value. So if you want to increase your capacity, you get an education and improve your skill, or you get a better job. And this is the advice we'd all give our kids if they were sitting in front of us, and I don't think Africa is any different. So framing it, I think Africa struggles from the perspective of it's producing very low value work, and for it to strengthen its negotiating power, increase its ability, just like China has done, it first needs to really think about how it elevates the quality of work it does. This is foundational. Now, we all remember a decade ago the African lions, Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, lions on the move, great McKinsey report. We had a promise, there was a lot of energy, this faltered. Our economies started growing. What were the major risks? Commodity-driven. Our growth was not driven by the capacity of the people, it was driven by the resources in the ground. And so we leaned very heavily into our commodities. When these faltered, our economies stumbled. Our GDP was a false start. It was an opportunity for us to do something different, but what we eventually did was just basically chase vanity metrics. And I will say it, GDP is a vanity metric. It doesn't really reflect the true productive capacity of a continent. And as a start, I would say in building the Africa we want, we can talk about the nice things to have, in a sense, better infrastructure, better integration, singular voices. But it's our capacity. It's a capacity to move beyond low-value commodities to high-value work, and our ability to galvanize the very best of us. Look, we will never all be equal. The way Nigerians sing and dance will never be the same way in which Egyptians sing and dance. But there's virtue and value in our diversity and the power of us harnessing the very best of each of us to become a better continent. So I would say in building our continent, we need to back the very best of us. We need to back the builders, we need to back the thinkers, and we need to back the individuals who are building that pipeline of talent. So every economy that grows is on the back of your champions. You find your champions, you support them, you get your capital markets, you galvanize. There's $1 trillion, $1 trillion sitting today in mobile wallets. $1 trillion, think about that. You know, in Africa's massive population, it's mobile, it has high agency, it has high energy, it has high talent, but very little skill. And I think in terms of thinking of a process, in building the Africa we want, we need to be able to galvanize behind regional champions who scale up and drag everybody else along, in thinking through how as a continent we become more productive on a global scale, whilst we also explore how we solve the very real interoperability challenges in Africa. So our digital interoperability, do we have the right digital infrastructure? Do we have the right financial market infrastructure? Financial markets are a very real thing. There's so much friction in moving money and moving it around the continent that if you don't have financial market infrastructure, the economy falls flat. Liquidity, there is no economy grows by holding your breath. You know, if you can't mobilize liquidity to galvanize, liquidity is the lifeblood of every economy. If you can't mobilize liquidity to galvanize your economy, there is no growth. Energy, and on and on and on. But I think the core of it is, where do you start from? I think the start is galvanizing our human potential until we can make a clean transition from pure commodity-driven markets to human capital-driven markets in every sector. We will continue to struggle with false starts, the promise of market opportunity, but very quickly lagging behind on the capacity, or the human capacity to deliver in it. And I think that's the hard conversation to have, because you can't turn on capacity. It's not a light switch. You know, we all have the will to win, but the will to prepare to win is a lot harder to find. And that's really what we need to begin from. We need to prepare. We need to build that capacity for a generation and set them up for success. And I think in building the Africa we want, I thought it was useful to frame that conversation before we get to the conversations around infrastructure and integration. On a very pragmatic level, I think the elephant in the room is, how are we thinking about our capacity? How are we developing it? And how are we galvanizing towards accelerating that capacity, possibly based on the regional strengths rather than trying to create duplication and a uniform playing field across the continent?